what's going on with our food supply in general?
Great question. Thank you. It's something I dove into deeply, and it came again organically, quote unquote, simply because my mom was an organic gardener as a kid, which was really radical, where most people use fertilizers and chemicals and stuff because they found that it was ways to make their garden. And but my mom was organic. We thought she was a little bit crazy, and we'd tease her about it. And then I went off to university and discovered that when I ate the university food, I didn't feel the same as when I ate the food that I had at home. And then I'd come back home in the summer and I felt the difference. I was like, well, wait a second, what's going on here? So I started looking into the origins of what happened with our food supply. And you have to go back to the 1940s in particular, which is a unique time in that after World War II, we had several pressures that came onto our farming situation. Number one, people moved from rural areas where there was a presence of localized produce into urban areas, and we started to really accelerate the manufacturing culture. That, and concordant to that, was the baby boom, an explosion in the population. So we had less people producing food and more people moving into the cities. And while that accelerated capital, it put a pressure on food supply. So governments said, what are we going to do? We need to start creating government boards and food regulatories, and started doing experiments. And they started making commodity type standards for how much we needed of this and how much we needed of that of food to make sure that we had food supply. Well, that made farmers move to commercialized farming, where they moved from crop rotation, which regenerated the soil. You'd go through, different crops each year. My mom still does this. She moves her crops from different spots each year. And then you have a year of fallow where you do nothing to the soil. And then you have another year where you you'll turn into like hemp and manure or minerals, depending on what's going on with the soil at that given time. And this was practiced for thousands of years by farmers. Well, under conversion, monoculture, commercialized things, we used machines. We had these giant infrastructures, sometimes subsidies. We started growing mass amounts of foods in super farms, essentially. Instead of the local family farm, you had these super farms. Well, what happened is they introduced nitrogen, which was leftover materials from bomb manufacturing, to accelerate the growth of the plants. So the initial benefit was obvious. You increase the yield of the plant. And part of the problem also came from just determining what was in food. And it was largely focused on protein, carbohydrates, fats, fibers, and the trace minerals, the amounts of minerals, the enzymatic content, the probiotic content was left out of the equation in identification. Well, then what began to happen is the plants began to weaken, and they would be more susceptible to insects, parasites, fungus, all of these different things that robust, healthy plants that have all these elements can protect themselves. And there's a carryover to humans. Well, guess what? The next thing that happened is, we developed chemical-based agents, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides to deal with these, and further weakening the nutritional value because we're growing the product, we're getting higher external yields with lower internal yields, a weakening of the plant, and we're not crop rotating like we used to, which would re-support the soil. And primarily, we started accelerating the loss of the nutrient quality of our foods while adding all these chemical agents, which disrupted enzymes, disrupted probiotics, disrupted how many minerals the plant was able to extract out of the soil, those little microorganisms that are essential to this. And what did we get? We've got today's modern food production. And if you look at the evidence, a great example is if they took the food nutritive value of a peach in California in 1955 and compared it to a peach produced today, and it was over 50 times the amount of nutrients in the 1955 peaches is today.
Wow. So right? What are we eating? I mean, what are we eating? We're eating calories and fiber, essentially.
Exactly. And one of the things that I've always suggested to individuals, if you want to get an illustration, is go take a strawberry, a great example, because strawberries, if you look at strawberries in the wild, they're like little teeny tiny strawberries. They can, like, it takes so long to pick a cup. I had to do it as a kid. I hated it. It would take so long to get a little cup of wild strawberries. And you go to commercialized strawberries and the farming and all of the components that go into strawberry. So go buy a box of strawberries from a regular conventional program. Go buy a box of strawberries from an organic store. And then go get one that's grown on a biodynamic farm. Mm-hmm. The difference in flavor, taste, the texture, the color, how it makes you feel in the body they're like different food categories. Now, this is across the board. Also, on top of that, we have overstimulated our sensory nerves to such an extent that we're not attracted to healthy food. We're attracted to chemicalized food through the abuse of technological and chemical production plants, which really emerged in the 1970s to get people to consume more of a product by creating mimickers that the body thinks is a nutrient it's getting from the food, but it's actually not, and may actually be a toxic element. So what that increased is the amount of consumption. If you can think back to the 70s, for those who are around there, this is when we went from the little tiny cans and little tiny bottles and little tiny bags to bigger size and super size and grand size and family size and all this sort of stuff. So people can't begin, and there's a correlation with obesity. And so what happens is people have been taught a caloric model of eating, which is propagated at every level of the nutrition industry, and a food paradigm that doesn't address the actual quality of the nutrients in a plant as opposed to the caloric content. Those two things cause people to overeat. And just like the plants, they get bigger, they grow more, that people are bigger and larger, largely because of chemicals, but they're sicker and less vital, just like the plants happened. And so now we're at this crossroads where we cannot get everything that we need out of our diets, no matter how healthy we try to eat. In fact, you're guaranteed a deficiency. Now, based on your genetics and your nutrigenomics is going to determine which things you're more predisposed to. But if you understand that and you're listening to Sara, she's going to be able to share with you specifically what I call the upstream issues. And so many of our best and brightest minds are coming into universities, coming into research fields, coming into political organizations, agricultural organizations, and they don't know the historical aspects of food. And they've never had real food in their own condition. And so what happens is they're operating inside a vacuum of comprehension, which is not accurate. And this has why we have had so many people getting fat, out of shape, they're sick, they don't know what's going on, they're getting genetic illnesses, they're susceptible to immune system responses that were not normal. Well, and an inability to procreate. Well, that's all largely because it's the food, and then you can add genetic modification and all that. So as health advocates for ourselves and for our families, it is up to us to recognize that we cannot rely on external authorities through our regulatory, our government, our political, and our education systems. They're simply not capable of arriving at accurate conclusions. So this is not a political statement or anything. It's just a fact. And so you can only, if you are looking inside a bubble of information, you are going to immediately come to erroneous conclusions if you don't know the whole picture. And you've got to get the whole picture. And I love what you had mentioned with reference to your supplements, because you're using many of the same philosophies that we use at Bioptimizers. And ironically, or maybe not so much, is almost all of the best companies I know started by a founder that had some sort of problem. They couldn't figure it out. They went downstream. They did their research. They went back in history. They figured it out. And they ended up producing a product or products that solve that particular problem. And it turns out it helped a lot of other people. That's the story of almost every great company I know. And it's no different for you.
Absolutely. And I that's why I align with you so much. But I want to emphasize a few things that you touched on. Number one, our soils are going to be completely depleted, and we better turn this around as humankind. Zach Bush I was at a dinner with him the other night, and he was talking about this. We are in dire straits as far as our soils go. And on the news last night, guess who is, and you know this, Wade, is the #1 landowner now of farmland, and that's Bill Gates. And I saw him sitting there going, oh, look at these amazing sausages that you can make out of growing, I don't even know, fungus or mushrooms or something. But it's so scary where our food supply is going. And you mentioned the plants are getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Well, then we eat them. They're obviously not even nutritious, but they are killing off our good gut microbiome. So we're not even absorbing any of the little nutrients that may even be in there. So it's just this vicious cycle, and we get sicker, like you said, and our body it's starving. So we constantly are eating because our brain is not getting the signal, oh, I've got enough nutrients, so I just need to keep eating and eating and eating. Thyroid goes down, obesity starts coming up, and the heart disease and all the metabolic diseases that are there. And it's amazing when someone starts reversing that trend, and they might have symptoms of heart disease and thyroid issues and inflammation and brain fog. And just by supplementing right, just by eating the right foods, eliminating the wrong foods, all of the symptoms start going away. All of the disease factors start going away. It's not like in the Western medical model where you take a medication for each one of the diseases. You are simply healing your body from the inside out, and everything else just kind of goes away. So